Welcome to the Create More Value podcast, sponsored by Fortuna Advisors, the boutique shareholder value improvement advisory firm. Create More Value is a series of conversations with senior executives, board members, investors, and other experts that have overcome challenges to create exceptional value for their companies. There are many ways to drive value, so we cover a wide range of topics. I am the host, Greg Milano, founder and CEO of Fortuna Advisors, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. I'd like to welcome Steve Chopp to the Fortuna Advisors podcast, Create More Value. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Thanks, Greg. Great to be here with you today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Me too. Steve's background is a blend of corporate and consulting roles with a focus on privately held and private equity-owned companies in the middle market. He's currently CFO and EVP of Strategy for Lief Labs, a private equity-owned manufacturer of dietary supplements. Prior to Lief, Steve was president of Core Jensen, COO and CFO of Bragg Live Food Products, and 7 years as EVP and CFO at Pharmavite LLC, the makers of Nature Made vitamins, which became the number one brand in the food, drug, mass, and club channel, with sales doubling and the value of the business more than tripling. On the consulting side, Steve has held senior roles at LEK Consulting and Stern Stewart & Company, where we met, and prior to Stern Stewart, Steve worked at Boise Cascade Office Products, where he was part of a team that acquired 30 companies in 18 months. Through all of his roles, Steve is focused on creating organizational alignment so individuals at all levels make decisions that are consistent with the strategy and create value. Looking forward to our discussion. Most of the executives I've invited to join this podcast are with large publicly owned companies. Steve, you've focused your career on smaller middle market companies that are privately owned. What are the big differences when it comes to embracing a value management approach?
Sure, interesting question, Greg. The funny thing is, I think there's probably more similarities than differences when you look at implementing value management, and whether it's a small company or a large company. When you think about it, the goal is the same. At the end of the day, you want to drive long-term sustainable improvements in value. And fundamentally, the principles of value creation doesn't change based on company size. Right? You're going to have a value metric as a true north, economic profit, EVA, residual cash earnings, something that takes into account kind of the key drivers of value, and you're going to have compensation programs in place to drive that value metric and try to align the organization. So those are similar with any size company that you're working with. I think what's different, as I think about it, and from my experience, is really the execution of value management and the implementation. And the speed of delivering results. So let me talk about that a little bit more in detail. Large companies. Early on in my career, I had the opportunities to work for and consult to some large cap companies. I worked at Nestle and Boise Cascade. I had the opportunity to consult to Disney and Hewlett Packard, and these are all great companies, and I was fortunate to have the opportunity to work with the great people there. I learned a lot, but what I also learned during that time is it's really hard to drive change, and seeing impact was really challenging to make happen. I mean, the analogy gets used all the time about you trying to turn around a large ship, and really felt that. And later I was fortunate, got exposure to smaller companies at my time at Stern Stewart, right? That's where you and I met. And, what I found is, with smaller companies, it's easier to implement value management. It's still not easy. We worked with companies, Weber Grill, McElhaney, who makes Tabasco. And what we learned during it was the change process. You could accelerate that much faster than you could in larger, more complex businesses. You could you could understand the business better because it's not as complex. A big part of it, we'll talk about it today, is changing culture and people and changing management. It's easier in smaller organizations. And I think what happened after I had the exposure there is those differences in the ability to implement value management have results and quicker. And that's what really drew me to the middle market and why I spent the last 20 plus years of my career in that space.
As we've worked with smaller companies at times, there's a need to take advantage of technology sometimes because the way we do training, for example, in large companies with very bespoke in-person training can be kind of expensive for smaller companies' budgets. Have you had experience with using like a lot of computer-based training or anything like that when you're trying to create any kind of, sort of changes in culture or performance at the companies you've worked at?
Yeah, we have used some computer-based training, but we've also taken advantage of some in-person training like value maps and the
Hmm.
like. But we've
Hmm.
had to be creative on how we did it. And the other thing is, I think in the smaller companies, you can take advantage of coaching and teaching people that are in the organization, and
Hmm.
that they take responsibility. Train the trainer
Hmm.
is much easier and more impactful in the smaller companies. And then you also get advocates as well,
That,
which is
yeah.
key to driving change. If you get people that are actually in the organization to believe what you're trying to do, that's when change happens.
Yeah. And when somebody knows they're going to have to train somebody else, they listen a lot more when you're training them.
No,
um,
exactly. And if they get engaged, right? That's the
yeah.
thing is, when we work with some companies, when on the consulting side, and what you found was you had some people that just bought in right away, and they
Hmm.
said, "Yeah, this is great. We're so glad you're here. It's going to help."
Hmm.
And then you had other people that were the naysayers, and what we learned early on was, hey, get the naysayers,
Hmm.
spend time with them, because if you can convert them and get them to be an advocate, the rest of the organization will follow.
Yeah. 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 That's actually interesting. One of the techniques I've learned about from for change management is every person in the organization, as you sort of brief them on what's happening, you assess are they green? Are they supportive? Are they red? Are they sort of counter to what we're doing, or are they yellow? They're kind of indifferent, and then focusing on the reds and converting them, just like you said, the naysayers. It really helps. It's a natural human behavior, I think, to focus on the people that agree with us, but finding the people that don't is actually much more effective. That's a good point. Okay, so building off of that conversation, when we spoke recently, you said metrics are interesting, but behavior is compelling. Please explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, sure. It's actually pretty interesting. I'd love to take credit for the quote, but the quote actually came from Bill Williams, who you know.
Hmm.
He was the leader of Stern Stewart's middle market practice. A learning we had after several implementations with Bill. Bill was an operator all of his career, and when he joined consulting, the real reason he joined consulting was he had been exposed to value management with Stern Stewart, and he thought that he could help make a big difference at companies,
Hmm.
and that's what got him excited, and his passion, and that was really the passion in our office as well. And back in that time, the kind of the early learnings at Stern Stewart, when we were doing the implementation, I think Greg, and this was probably the same thing you guys were doing too. It was, hey, when you get there, the two big things to do. One is define the EVA metric for them so that it makes sense for their business and that it ties to value, and then put together an incentive plan that ties to improvements in EVA. And if you do that, when the company grows in value, then people get paid for that, and that should be that's a fair exchange. And so essentially, we thought by creating an environment with those two things, that value would follow. And what we found was it wasn't the case when we were looking at it, because what we saw, we implemented EVA at a number of companies. I mentioned McElhaney and Weber Grill, companies that had success, but we also had a number of companies that really didn't receive any benefits from it. And that's what became really frustrating. We'd work with them for 6 months to a year, and then a year later, they've abandoned the program or they're
Hmm.
getting nothing from it. And, what we were trying to figure out is why, because we were doing the same things. And so
Hmm.
why were we getting different results? And
Yeah.
what we found by going through it was you could when companies that hired us kind of fell into two categories. There was one category where you had a senior team, a management team that had a vision of what they were trying to do. And when they learned about, what we were talking about from a value management framework, they said, that aligns with what we're trying to do. It's kind of might be the missing piece, right?
Hmm.
Because they didn't have that component to it. Companies that hired us for that reason, those were the ones that had a much higher probability of success. It wasn't guaranteed success, but much higher probability. The ones that hired us, and at that time, right, if you go back to this period, shareholder value was hot. So
Hmm.
everybody, it wasn't that hard to sell during that period. We were also getting hired by senior teams because, hey, one of their board members was on the board of another company
Hmm.
that implemented value management framework, so you guys should.
Hmm.
Or the CEO of the company had a friend who had a CEO friend who also implemented it, told him to implement it. So they weren't
Hmm.
bringing us in for a reason. They were bringing us in because, hey, it was what others were doing, and we should do that.
Hmm.
Um, and so, what we found was that the ones that were using it to really come in and drive the right behaviors that would align with, tie to their strategy and align with value, those were the ones that got the benefit from it.
Hmm.
And shortly after that, I went in the office one morning and Bill had written up on the whiteboard that phrase: metrics are interesting, but behaviors are compelling. And that the insight there, it was, it was interesting for us. But again, back to the behavior change, the behaviors change for us. We marketed very differently then. When we started going to, prospective clients, we talked to them about this is a way to drive change. And it's really a change management initiative, but if you do it
Hmm.
right, it drives a lot of value. And it probably, to be honest on that approach, it probably cost us a few engagements because there was one we probably could have. There's several we probably could have closed, and
Hmm.
we had just done the old approach. But what we wanted to do is make sure that it would impact, it would impact the clients that we spent time with. I think, the other thing, so that helped from a business perspective, but then for me, it also had a major impact on my career and how I thought about things was really about how are we going to, implement, a value management approach that changes
Hmm.
behavior. So I guess the net of it, the experience when, we used to think it was just, hey, put in a metric and put in incentives. But really, you have to have the leadership team that has the vision and wants to use it for change management. Those three items become kind of what are table stakes to give you a shot at implementing value management
Hmm.
and doing
Hmm.
that well. It's still hard, but if you don't have those, don't even start.
Yeah, I think that's really, really great advice. I can remember back then companies that would hire us just because they wanted to tell their investors they hired us. They had no real intention of changing anything, but it was the investors they were trying to impress because we were on the cover of Fortune magazine, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that's still the case today. I think we'll go beyond just getting them aligned with the idea of changing behavior. Even then, often they still don't know what it is, what the behaviors are that they're trying to change to. They don't, fully understand what an ownership culture is like. Even though we say the words, hearing the words and actually embracing it, could be a different thing. So I find that, I use the term soak time, which is something we used to use in engineering. An airplane, is up at minus 65 degrees, and after a certain amount of time, the sort of heat soaks out of the plane or the cold soaks into the plane, depending on how you want to think about it. And it's the same thing with people. You hit them with these concepts and principles enough times, it starts to soak in and they start to embrace it. So that's really well put. I like that saying. So we've talked about this basically already, but you made a change from consulting to corporate. What made you decide to make that change?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was coming out of grad school, I had no plans to go into consulting again. Undergrad, I came out, I did consulting. I was working a ton of hours on projects I didn't enjoy,
Hmm.
and my focus then became on going corporate. And so when I came out of grad school, went into corporate. You mentioned Boise Cascade, Office Products. That's
Hmm.
where I went initially, and that was happening at that time. So this is the late '90s, and shareholder value is really hot. There's a lot of consulting firms that are doing some good work in the space, and then you've also got in the press, it's getting a lot of coverage. So it was really interesting to me, and it just made a lot of sense, and it was aligned with the work that I was doing, and so I got really interested in it, and that's why I went into it, but I never went into consulting thinking I'd be there forever.
Hmm.
What I went into consulting for is I thought that was a great way to learn about value management. What I
Hmm.
didn't know was when I'd go back. And after a while, I was in it for about 8 years, and I started to think about, really, if I could find the right opportunity, that it was probably time to make a move to see if I could. I've been talking to clients about, hey, here's what you need to do, but actually go in and work with companies and do that, and
Hmm.
it's much harder on the inside. And the opportunity that came into play was with Pharmavite, you mentioned earlier, the maker of Nature Made supplements. I had been consulting, I started consulting to them, and that's interesting too, because I wasn't supposed to be on with the client. We had two other principals that had other things come up. And so I ended up with Pharmavite, and we were working on developing a performance-based long-term incentive plan. And one of the initial meetings with the team, as we were going along, was around what metric to use. And they had already had discussions. The project had been going for a little bit of time, and what they hadn't talked about economic profit. So I said, well, now that I was on my own there, I put it in there for the discussion because I just thought it would be fun just to see how people reacted. I didn't expect it to get much traction when we were in the meeting. And then in the meeting, the CEO really started to engage when we talked about economic profit. It wasn't something that he had seen before. And he started to ask really good questions. And he said, at the end of the day, he started to go, well, this is how I think about things. And this is how people should, that I want people in the company to think about it. It's, hey, how much did we invest? What did we, receive for that investment? And did it compensate us for the risk? And so that was kind of, when I heard that, it was great in the meeting because I didn't expect it. So I came out of there with a little bit of energy. But then after that, I started to think, that, hey, Pharmavite would probably be a good opportunity for me in the sense that in the question earlier, they had the table stakes in place. They had a strong leadership team. I'd gotten to know them over the time that I consulted to them. They were putting in a value metric, and they were tying incentives to it. So it was the table stakes to give us a shot with value management. What I didn't know at the time was if there was a role. And so, we had a few conversations, and fortunately I was able to join. And at that point I joined to head up strategy and corp dev.
So you had a very long, successful career there at Pharmavite. What were some of the key lessons you learned from that experience that would be helpful to other leaders of middle market private companies?
Yeah, it was a lot of learning for me in the sense that, like I said, I had been consulting about it for 8 years, but now I got the chance to be on the inside and see what we can do. I was fortunate to go into a situation where we had, a really strong team. We had a organization of people that were committed to Pharmavite and wanted to do the right things and make Pharmavite better. And we had a really good CEO during that time, and we had tremendous results at the end of the day. You mentioned earlier, we became the number one brand in the space. Our sales doubled. Our ROIC increased 5 times. Value of the business more than tripled. It was big numbers. And looking back on it, I wouldn't say there's like any silver bullet that we did that could point to, hey, we did this and this is why all this stuff happened. I think what it was we spent a lot of time focusing on doing things to create org alignment and changing behaviors like that, getting people to, you mentioned it earlier, but and this is where I kind of coined it or came through with it, is helping, we want individuals in the company to make decisions that align with the strategy and drive value. If you can do both of those things, you're on your way to creating a lot of value. It's easy to do one of the two. It's not easy to do both. So, what I can cover off that might be helpful is kind of the key steps we went through.
Okay.
So that you can see like kind of our journey through it at Pharmavite.
That sounds good.
Like I mentioned, we had the table stakes in place coming in. We had the management team, we had the value metric, and we had incentives done right. What we really needed was kind of our playbook on how do we now that we have that in place, if we're going to put a value management program and really have it change behaviors, how do we do that? And so, and the first step for us was really on the strategy side. We had to get a sense of, at the leadership team level, where were we going as a company? And what was interesting, and we had a really talented team, which I think made a lot of this happen. But we also, at that time, had very different views of where the business was. So we had kind of start that off on the strategy side, is we wanted to create a really good understanding of our situation and what we're dealing with. So we had a 5-day offsite where we took a dispassionate view of the business and said, this is where we're at. This is how we're performing today. And there was some good stuff. that we're doing, and there was some bad stuff. But
Mhm.
now what we had was a common fact set, because before what we had was individuals had their own views, but the data might not be there. So the person that was the best debater would probably win the meeting,
Mhm.
essentially, or get their whatever they were proposing. But now
Yeah.
what we tried to really move to was fact based. We had the
Mhm.
understanding, and now once we had the understanding of where we sat, the question became: we have a few different options of where we could head. What do
Mhm.
we want to focus on? And so we came out of that meeting with the focus, and it was, there were some painful moments in the meeting, but it was also a big turning point for us. So that was part now the strategy. So now once we became, at the leadership team level, aligned on where we wanted to head, now it became, how do we get alignment in the organization? How do we
Mhm.
cascade it through so that people, when they're doing their planning, are doing things that align to where we want to go, and then
Mhm.
when they're doing goal setting, that it's aligned to where we want to go. And the idea, right, at the end of the day, is we wanted to cascade. And what we started with, you asked about tools that we used in the
Mhm.
in the past. We used a tool to communicate strategy called learning maps. They're knowledge maps, they're value maps. There's different terms for them, but essentially it's a 3 foot by 5 foot visual that uses some kind of scene, whether it's climbing a mountain or a raceway. There's different ways to present it, but to present what's going on with your strategy and where you're going with your business. We took all 1,000 people at Pharmavite through the maps, and we were doing them at 3 in the morning, right? Because we had a third shift going at that time. So everybody went through it. It was a great way to get the initial cascading in the organization, understand where we wanted to go and communicate, and then everything we did around planning and goal setting, kind of, we made sure that it laddered up in the sense that the corporate set, leadership team set the corporate strategy. Then within the corporate strategy, business teams were then tasked with defining their strategies to tie to the corporate strategy. And then departments were tasked to, hey, if this is what the business teams are trying to do, what do we as departments have to do to support that, and then build our capabilities going forward? And
Mhm.
then it cascades down at the individual level to, what we want people to understand is, what's the strategy of the business, what's the value, how do we define value, and then what's my role in creating that. And
Mhm.
the other piece, like getting down to the individual level, so we were doing performance management, would come out of the planning process.
Mhm.
Our HR played a big role in this piece. So now we had, now what we felt is, hey, and this took time, right? So the first year with all this stuff, there's a maturing process. You have to kind of look at where you're at, and then each year you become a little bit better at it.
Mhm.
But we came out of here, and individuals had goals that essentially laddered up to where we were headed.
Mhm.
Um, I think the other side note, and I'll get into the feedback loop because that's really critical going forward. But what we found out that was really nice, this is probably 5 or 6 years later, we had Hay come in and do an engagement survey.
Mhm.
And usually what happens with those surveys, and they're really helpful, is they come in and they show all these different facets, and usually you're way below, and here's the steps and how we can help you to drive those up. As we
Mhm.
were going through them, one of the things that stood out to them and they couldn't understand is people's ranking on understanding of the strategy and their role was like, you know, 90th percentile. It was really
Wow.
high. You couldn't figure out like why that would be. And we
Mhm.
didn't either, because this is like 5 years later. I mean, we had
Mhm.
done stuff to reinforce it. But then after a while, it's like, the work that we had done really helped people engage in the strategy,
Mhm.
which is, you can't, and you mentioned technology based, you can't underestimate the amount of work you need to do to create that alignment, and you need to be consistent with it. It's not a one time thing, it's an everyday thing.
Mhm.
So once you have the alignment, then what was really important is, okay, we said what we're going to do, and we said, when that's going to happen, what those results are going to look like, and the metrics around that. Now you have to put in some accountability with, the execution and the feedback loop. We did a lot around feedback because we wanted to understand performance earlier. Our view
Mhm.
was, hey, if I can identify a problem sooner in the process, I have more options to solve it, right? I have more
Mhm.
time, that gives me more options to solve it. We did a lot of communication with um, meetings with management every month. We had town halls with the entire organization. We were consistent in those meetings, and we were consistent on how we spoke about the business in those meetings. There was a lot of work around individual performance management. That was a big, that was, these all were tied in. They weren't disparate processes. And what
Hmm.
we talked about, I mean, I think the kind of one of the mantras we had talked about was, John Cotter, who was big on the time on driving change and has written some really good things. His comment was, even if you think you're over communicating, you're probably under communicating to the organization by a factor of 10. And we held that out a bit, as well as, we've got to make sure we're always communicating, because we want to make sure that people understand where we are, understand how what they're doing is impacting results, and if they need to adapt and change behaviors, they'll do so. So the results, they came in. We started to build momentum, and like I said at the beginning, you really can't point to one thing, um, but you can point that we did a lot of things and we stayed consistent. One other thing I'll add too, because I think it's worthwhile. We had a great leader during that time. Connie Berry was our CEO, and she did a tremendous job with this, and also gave people this kind of the space to make it all happen. And she was a big driver behind making all this change happen.
That's really, really a great story. And that sounds like a very thorough process. I like that it's the different parts of what you did were very integrated. So it wasn't a bunch of disparate activities, but it all had a strategy and a theme. Very, very, very good.
Yeah, we call it integrated planning but I think it understates it. It shouldn't be. It's the key is having the word integrated in there. I
Hmm.
haven't come up with a better word yet for that, but
Hmm. That's good. Um, Final question, just on a similar, sort of from a similar perspective, beyond Pharmavite, what other experiences have you had at the other companies you've been at that you think could be, interesting for people running companies like yours?
yeah, I mean, I think, since, that farmer, like most of the companies I've worked with have been on the smaller middle market companies with private equity ownership. And, my learning coming in those different is they're all different.
Hmm.
But you have the same game plan, and you have to meet them where they are. Some of these companies I've worked with have been turnaround, some have been growth. Um, the basics are there. Like we talked about earlier, the difference between small and large, the basics are there. You have to first get table stakes. You got to get the right leadership team. If you don't have the right leadership team place, hold off on everything else.
Hmm.
You're not going to make the progress. Get the value metric in place and get the incentives. And then once you do that, then you run a playbook.
Hmm.
People's may look different than what I just described that we did at Pharmavite, but you run the playbook too, so that people are making decisions that align with the strategy and create value. And you have to really push to gain alignment in the organization, every day at every opportunity when you're talking to people. And you have to get leaders that are doing that. And if
Hmm.
the leaders are aligned, if you have misalignment of the leaders too, that's going to cause a problem. But if the leaders are aligned and doing that'll go a long way. I mean, I think, one good example on leadership, and this was more on this is a transaction one, but it was also the message that got sent to the organization. I mentioned Weber Grill earlier.
Hmm.
Weber, was a client, and then maybe a year or two after the implementation, they came to us and they were evaluating a potential acquisition. They were probably a little bit farther along than evaluating. I mean, they had already made an offer and they were pretty far through it. Um, but what they were looking for was, hey, can you tell us what this looks like from a value perspective? So, we did, we built the models. We were able to tell them, our view of it. And our view was that they were overpaying for the business. And it was a great business. The one they were
Hmm.
buying was a really interesting business, would have played well with Weber. The problem is the economics didn't make sense to
Hmm.
move forward. And that was a real turning point because the leadership team wanted to do the deal.
Hmm.
Uh, but if they had done the deal, I think the bigger thing, one is it likely would have destroyed value.
Hmm.
But then the second part of it is organizationally, there have been a number of other people that were exposed to the transaction and saw kind of where, the thought on the valuation. If
Hmm.
they had kind of made that deal and kind of went against the concepts of creating value, that would have set their organization back a long way as leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But they made the right call, and the business has done really well since then.
That's a
I
great
think
example.
at the end of the day, kind of a couple things. I think coming in, you have to understand where the company is from a maturity perspective. When you get that strategy in place, I mean, this is a quote I love too, is, you don't have strategy until you can say no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think value management can help you with that. I think the the one that, Greg, and this came from somebody at Stern Stewart. You may know exactly who, but the idea that people would come with projects and say they're strategic,
Mm-hmm.
and that is just it still happens today. And people come in and they say the project's strategic, and the answer usually is, well, that probably means the economics aren't there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so what you
Totally.
have to have is a strategy where you can say no. Value management
Mm-hmm.
can help you create the discipline around that. I think there's also, maybe the last two things on this is, one, there's a balance between moving as fast as the organization can go, because you have to take that into account. But you also have to balance and check it with, is it moving fast enough based on what's happening with competitive pressures?
Mm-hmm.
Because you may not have the luxury of time, so you need to take that into account. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is, one, trust the process. It takes time. Stick with it. Stick to using that value lens. The fundamentals don't change, but if you stick with it over time, you will certainly increase your probability of creating value in the future.
Well, this has been really great. I really appreciate it. We've been listening to Steve Chopp talk about applications of value management to smaller and private companies. Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate you joining me.
Thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed the discussion.
You have been listening to Create More Value, sponsored by Fortuna Advisors, and I am your host, Greg Milano, founder and CEO of Fortuna Advisors. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Fortuna Advisors helps companies with strategy, capital deployment, business management, corporate culture, and incentive compensation, all aimed at driving top quartile total shareholder return and the equivalent for private companies. To learn more, contact us at info@fortuna-advisors.com.